It was late autumn when Mark, a folklore professor, found himself in a small, isolated village nestled deep within the hills of Scotland. He was there to research local legends and ghost stories, having heard whispers of a haunted graveyard at the edge of town. The townsfolk called it the resting grounds, and Mark quickly learned why. Hidden away behind dense fog and trees, the cemetery was ancient, with graves dating back hundreds of years. But one grave in particular piqued Mark's curiosity, the 13th grave. Unlike the others, it had no name, no date, and no flowers, only a weathered stone marker with an unsettling inscription: "Here lies the one who should never have lived." Locals claimed it was cursed, and that anyone who lingered there too long would face misfortune, madness, or worse. Children dared each other to visit it on Halloween, but even the bravest kids stayed away after dusk. Intrigued, Mark approached the village pub to gather more information. When he mentioned the 13th grave, a hush fell over the crowd. The bartender, an older man with deep-set wrinkles, looked at him with a stern gaze and leaned in close. "That grave's been here longer than any of us. Some say it's been around since before the church was built," he warned. "They say it belongs to a man who never died, or at least, who never stayed dead." Despite the warnings, Mark was determined to visit the grave. After all, it was his job to document these tales, and besides, he didn't believe in curses. That night, armed with a flashlight and his notebook, he made his way through the foggy streets toward the graveyard. As he entered the cemetery, a chill ran down his spine, but he brushed it off as the cold autumn air. The moonlight cast long shadows over the graves, illuminating the twisted branches that seemed to reach out like bony fingers. Finally, he reached the 13th grave. Standing before it, Mark examined the gravestone. It was unusually tall, weathered by time, and covered in strange symbols he didn't recognize. As he ran his hand over the stone, a sudden gust of icy wind swept through the cemetery, almost knocking him off balance. But Mark continued his research, jotting down notes, feeling oddly drawn to the grave as though something, or someone, were compelling him to stay. After an hour, he decided to leave, feeling a growing sense of unease. But as he turned to walk away, he heard something, a faint whisper carried by the wind, barely audible. "Help me." Mark froze, his heart pounding. He scanned the cemetery, but he was alone. Or so he thought. The whisper came again, louder this time. "Help me, I can't rest." Against his better judgment, Mark knelt beside the grave, pressing his ear close to the ground, hoping to hear the voice more clearly. That's when he felt something, or someone, grab his wrist. He looked down in horror to see a bony hand, ashen and decayed, reaching out from beneath the ground, its fingers wrapped around his wrist like a vice. Panicked, he tried to pull away, but the grip only tightened. The earth around him began to tremble, and the air grew thick with the stench of decay. Just as he thought he'd be dragged into the grave itself, the hand let go, sinking back into the ground as if it had never been there. Mark stumbled back, gasping, and fled the cemetery. But his encounter left him deeply shaken. Over the next few days, he felt as if he were being followed. Shadows moved in his peripheral vision, and he heard whispers in empty rooms. He brushed it off as paranoia, convincing himself it was just his imagination. But the curse of the 13th grave was just beginning. A week later, Mark returned to his university. He resumed teaching, trying to push his experience out of his mind. But he began to have vivid nightmares. In each dream, he found himself back at the cemetery, standing before the 13th grave, hearing the same whispers, feeling the same cold, bony fingers on his skin. One night, he awoke in a cold sweat and found dirt smeared across his sheets, as if he'd been digging with his bare hands. The dirt reeked of decay. The nightmares grew more intense, and soon, they began to bleed into his waking life. One evening, Mark looked into his bathroom mirror and saw a reflection that wasn't his own. A face, gaunt and pale, with hollow, pleading eyes, staring back at him. The reflection mouthed the words, "Set me free." Determined to end the haunting, Mark decided to return to the village. He tracked down the same bartender, who, seeing the desperation in Mark's eyes, revealed a long-held secret. The man buried in that grave, they say he was a grave robber, a man who defiled the dead, searching for wealth in the graves of others. He was cursed for his sins, condemned never to find peace. The townsfolk buried him alive, marking him as the 13th grave, an eternal warning. The bartender handed Mark an old iron key and pointed him toward an abandoned chapel near the cemetery. "The only way to free him is to unearth the truth," he said. "But be warned, you may find more than you bargained for." Armed with the key, Mark returned to the cemetery that night. In the cold silence, he dug deep into the 13th grave, ignoring the fear gnawing at him. As he dug, he uncovered a rusted iron box sealed with symbols similar to those on the gravestone. Inside, he found a journal, ancient and brittle, written by the condemned man himself. The journal revealed a dark history. The man had been cursed not for grave robbing, but for something far worse. He had been a practitioner of forbidden rituals, attempting to resurrect the dead to achieve immortality. His final entry read, "I failed to cheat death, but one day, someone will hear my voice and set me free." As Mark finished reading, the air grew icy, and the earth beneath him shifted. The whispers rose into a wail, filling his mind with visions of the man's life and his twisted deeds. Mark's mind spun as he realized the man didn't want freedom. He wanted a body to possess, a way back into the world of the living. In a last-ditch effort, Mark tossed the journal back into the grave and began to cover it with soil. But as he buried the box, he felt an overpowering urge to keep digging, his hands moving of their own accord. The curse had taken hold. Hours later, Mark's colleagues found him, kneeling by the 13th grave, his hands bloodied and his eyes vacant, muttering the same phrase over and over, "I should never have lived." They say that if you visit the cemetery at night, you can still hear Mark's voice among the whispers, begging to be freed from the 13th grave. And now, when you pass the grave, you'll find two stone markers, both nameless, side by side, the final resting places of two souls who should never have lived.